Hi, welcome to PrepBytes, and in this video we're going to be discussing the roadmap for going from zero to mastery in backend development. So before we go in and start up the entire discussion that we have, if you are starting on with full stack development, backend especially can seem scary because you don't have much clarity into what you're getting into. So even though it is a scary thing to go in and start with, it does go in and reward immensely, and does make sense when the average seasoned backend developer gets an annual compensation around 8 lakhs to 17 lakhs per annum. So now the question comes, what exactly do we mean by this backend? Or what exactly is this backend development? What does a backend developer do, right? So if I want to become a backend developer, what all skill sets do I require? Or what all companies are there that hire backend developers? All of these and much more, we'll be answering these questions in this particular video. So I suggest that you watch till the end such that you can get all the clarity that you need with every aspect that is there to backend development. So within this, the very first thing we kind of are already somewhat familiar with, if you're starting with full stack development, a front-end developer basically goes in and controls everything that you can see in a website. Right. So he'll be the person who's going to work on HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all the other frameworks, and he's going to look the website look nice because that is the user interface, right? So the front-end developer is basically the person who controls everything you can see. So a backend developer in turn should basically mean that controls everything you shouldn't see or you can't see. Okay, so there are three main functionalities when you think in terms of backend. There are three main functionalities that you want, and across our roadmap, every single technology that we're going to see will eventually aid us in going and getting those three functionalities. Okay, so backend developers are involved in three things, you could say. The first would be data storage, because your website would require some kind of information, like let's say images, files, lots and lots of text information. So all of this data needs to be stored somewhere. So that's one of these things which a backend developer will be looking into. Another aspect would be that of security, because you don't want your web application to be easily hacked by all this the people who are going in and doing these unethical practices, right? And then there are tons and tons of other server-side functions that needs to be taken care of. Do keep in mind, like data storage, security, and these server-side functions I'm talking about, these are things that an average user needs to go in and see. And that's exactly where the backend developer is meant for, right? So backend developers are basically experts who build and maintain the mechanisms which basically processes all the data and perform actions on whatever web application that you've created. Okay, so when you're thinking in terms of backend, right? So let's try to define what exactly backend would mean. Backend, you could say, is all the technology that is required for you to go in and process the what you could say, they process the incoming request. Because let's say if I'm going in and I'm using an application right now, so my application that I'm using in my phone needs to now go in and interact with the server, right? So what my device will do is it'll go in and send in a request. So backend will be that technology which is going to process that incoming request and generate a proper response in according to the request that it went in and received, right? So that's kind of it. It's basically there to process all the incoming requests and generate the corresponding response to the client. I am the client in this scenario, right? So this typically will have three major parts. Okay, the first one will be the server. Okay, so this is the computer which goes in and receives the request. So if I'm using an application in my phone or in my laptop right now, the request is going to be sent on to this server. All right. The second one that we have is called as the client or the application, you could say, and this generally goes in and will be responsible for sending in the request. And the third and the most lucrative one is the database. Okay, I need to store information. Where though? Okay, so we have tons and tons of databases that we can go in and utilize such that this data, this persistent data, can be organized and stored. All right. So just to summarize this entire thing up, backend. Okay, what exactly is backend? So backend is the code that runs on the server, and it does three things mainly. Okay, first it will go in and receive the request from the client. Second, it sends a response to the client according to whichever request it received. And third, it also provides a database for persistent storage, because yes, every application out there will require some amount of memory for it to work. So moving on, how exactly should you go in and start preparing up to become a backend developer? Much like every other roadmap that we've been through, the entire roadmap for backend development will also have several milestones. The very first one, the very first milestone that you will have to go in and cross will be that of going in and learning a general purpose programming language. There are tons and tons of general purpose programming languages out there. We have C#, we have JavaScript, Python, Java, PHP. And these are just the most commonly used ones. There are other languages as well, which I didn't get enough space to put in here. But the overall thing being, see, whichever general purpose programming language that you're going to choose, it will have its own set of frameworks, language-based frameworks, right? So depend if you're going to go in and take in, let's say, Python, you're going to most probably work with Django. If you're going to go with JavaScript, you might end up working with Node or with Express, right? So in the same sense, the general purpose programming language that you're going to be starting out with, just go in through the basics. You should go in and know what is the major advantages of using that particular language and what all advantages do you go in and get with it. Okay. Now, one suggestion that I would give is, if you want to go in and start with backend development, having at least a bit of information or a bit idea on how front-end development works will give you a really huge edge over in understanding all the concepts that are needed in backend development. So in case you want to go through the roadmap for front-end development, it will be linked in the description down. So you can go in and see through the entire roadmap for becoming a front-end developer. Now, if you are familiar with front-end development, JavaScript is a programming language that you will have or you should have mastery over. And I'll say, if backend is your thing, JavaScript is a pretty good language to go in and select as your optimal programming language. Okay, even though there are tons of options out there, JavaScript is pretty powerful and comes with tons and tons of frameworks that you could utilize. So once you have a general purpose programming language in your bag, you can now go in and move on to our second milestone, which is going in and learning the nooks and crevices of Git and GitHub. Now, even though Git and GitHub will not have much in the aspect of backend development, if you're working in a team, in a group of people, and you're working on a certain project, Git and GitHub allows you to go in and get two major functionalities. First one is going to be collaboration. You will be able to go in and collaborate with the people that are working alongside you. And the second would be that of version control. In case something goes wrong, you will be always able to go in and revert back to the functioning version of your app. So this is all in terms of Git. So you'll have to go in and get familiar with the Git tools, the various terminologies, how to stage and commit, undo the changes, branching, and at the very end, how to collaborate. Now, Git and GitHub, regardless of whichever tech stack that you're working in, is a really important skill set to have. All right. So once we're done with Git and GitHub, we'll go in and we'll be moving on to a third milestone, which is the most lucrative and important one, I'll say, out of all the milestones that we have. So initially, if you remember, we did go in and say that backend basically will serve three purposes: sending a request, sending back a response, and then the storage, right? So all the milestones that we're discussing in here will gradually tie up and create that schema, that entire ecosystem, which allows an application to go in and function out and cater out to these tons and tons of people who are going to be using it. Okay, so the third milestone that we have is going to be that of databases. The idea of databases is really simple. You are going to go in and store information in your databases. Now, generally, there are two types of databases that you might go and use. The first one is called as relational databases, where all the information is going to be stored in tables. All right. And the second one that we have is called as non-relational databases, where the information is stored in a non-tabular form, where the storage, where a particular storage model is used. For example, in MongoDB, you store information as collections or data objects. Okay, so these are the two different types of relational databases. These are the two types of databases that you can come across. Now, one thing I'll suggest is to go in and get acquainted with at least one of each type. Usually, when people tend to go in with relational databases, there are tons and tons of options that you get. But mostly, people tend to go in and prefer MySQL. MySQL, or as people usually say, MySQL, is a pretty common database to go in and start your backend career in, because it is widely used and it's fairly easy to pick up as well. You have other options like Oracle, PostgreSQL, and IBM DB2 that you can go in and utilize according to your requirement. Talking in terms of the non-relational databases, we have tons and tons of non-relational databases as well. Starting with the most common one, which is MongoDB, we have Cassandra, Firebase, and Redis. All right. So these specific databases allow you to go in and store information in a non-tabular format. All right. Now, once you are somewhat familiar, once you have grasp about on a few of these databases, I highly recommend that you go in and you learn one of each type, a relational database and another one which is a non-relational database. Okay, so once this is done, you can then go in and move on to the next aspect, which is to go in and learn a specific framework. To be more precise, a language specific framework. Now, those languages that we initially listed out, JavaScript, C#, PHP, Python, yeah, you could go in and utilize them to, to create up or to do everything in your backend. But talking about a large scale project or a large scale application, it isn't that convenient, I'd say, in a production level. So that's where these framework, these language specific frameworks will come in handy. So they have tons and tons of pre-built libraries, modules, and all of these things that you can utilize, which makes the entire process of production way too easy for us. In terms of JavaScript, the most used, according to the survey which was conducted by Stack Overflow in the 2022, Node.js was the most used or the most loved JavaScript framework, because it not only can be used for front end, it's also pretty lucrative to be used in terms of backend as well. You have also another JavaScript framework which is called as Express. The Express.js framework also is based on Node.js, but is a bit more on the lightweight side. If you want to go in and work around with Python, you can go with the Django framework. And if PHP is your forte, sure, you can go with Laravel in that case. So these language-specific frameworks will go in and vary. Like, the overall functionality that they give is the same. On a production level, you will be able to go in and integrate and perform those three operations that we had initially went in and said: sending a request, sending back a response, and basically utilizing your database. So you can use up these frameworks to go in and coordinate those operations. Okay, so depending on which language you are which general purpose programming language you have mastery over, you can go in and pick up a certain language specific framework to go in and work at. Because on a general scale, when you're working in a firm or on a certain project, rather than using the language alone, frameworks are preferred more, as on a production level, they are way more effective. The next milestone that you'll go in and come across is called as APIs, or application programming interface. An application programming interface, or an API, is basically a way, or it's for two or more computers to just communicate with each other, right? So there are tons and tons of APIs that are out there, okay? But the idea here is really simple. Let's say I want to go in and see what is happening in Twitter. So one thing I can do, okay, number one, is that I could go in and open up Twitter in my web browser and access whatever data I need. But the other way is, the number two, is I could go in and utilize the Twitter API because I want to go in and fetch information from Twitter. So Twitter again provides this Twitter REST API, which you could utilize to go in and fetch all the data without having to visit it. Okay, so that's what APIs do. Rather than going in and fetching in information by yourself by going to that particular browser and fetching it on, these certain set of APIs allow you to fetch that information directly. All right. One of the most famous APIs that are out there is the REST API, which is the representational state transfer API, which kind of helps us to do the same. Best example, Twitter API, Google API, right? Every time you order something on Zomato or on any food delivery apps, it shows in this map to you, right? So that map is courtesy of the Google Map API, which all of these product-based companies are basically borrowing from Google. Okay. Another pretty useful one is called the JSON API, which allows you to go in and get tons and tons of data in JSON format. And then we have the SOAP API as well. Apart from these, you can also go in and create up your own APIs because these will help you to go in and communicate through the web server to the application and get, basically bring in that communication, that two-way communication or one-to-one or one-to-many type of communication over the internet. Once this is done, the next or the last milestone that we'd be going in for will be that of web servers. Okay, web servers is a pretty simple idea. So if for the people, if you're going to go in and learn any of those language specific frameworks that we talked about, let's say you went in and you learned Node or let's say Django, right? You can go in and create a nodejs server by yourself or a Django server or a deployment server, right? A Django deployment server. And you could deploy it, yeah. And then you can go and call your friend and say, okay, buddy, so this is the URL where my app is hosted. You can use it whenever you want, sure. But on a larger scale, for around 10 to 20 people, your deployment server, your Node.js or your Django server will work, sure, great. But on a larger scale, if it goes more than, let's say, 50, right, your website will definitely go and crash because the deployment server that you are running using Node servers or like the Django framework will eventually go in and crash depending on your system. All right. So that's kind of where we need these third-party web servers. A web server is basically just a computer. Okay. So it's a computer that stores the web server software and the web applications component files. Now, what I mean by component files is like a web application will have tons of HTML pages, right? HTML pages will require their own CSS, their own JavaScript, some images and all of that. So these are what we call as component files. So your web servers will be responsible to go in and store all these component files, all right? So the web server will go in and connect to the internet and it kind of provides or supports this physical data interchange with other devices that are connected over the web, okay? So there are several options that are available within the market. The most common ones being Nginx, Apache, Caddy, and Microsoft IIS. Right? So these are the most common web servers that are in use. There are tons and tons of other web services that are available as well, but these are the most common ones. So once you go through all of these milestones, you kind of will be able to create up or identify how this entire application would work, including the backend, right? So initially you would go in and have a web application which is going to communicate over the internet utilizing your API. So it will go in and get in touch with the web server, which will go in and fetch all the required data from the database and send in the data back again. So one thing you'll notice over here is the data that is being flown over here is bidirectional because there is a need for you to go in and send requests and accept responses. So the web application will be going in and sending in data as well as receiving the data via the backend. So everything in from the API, the web server, and the databases, this is what a backend developer must go in and build and maintain. All right. So once you have learned all of these specific technologies, the way to go in and gain mastery is to start working on small projects. You can take up a project on your own. Right? Try building in, pick up a particular framework and a free web server, which there are tons of services which provide free web servers, right? So you can go in and utilize them and try it in by yourself because there will be a lot of things that you learn on a practical basis rather than just going through tutorials one after another. Okay, so the best way to go and gain mastery is through practice, through making small projects and applications. Okay, and the last thing that I have left to discuss is the companies that hire backend developers. There are tons and tons of companies. These are just the major ones that I could go in and list out over here. We have companies like Google, Apple, IBM, Axios, Toyota Connected, Yelp, Autodesk, and Splunk. These are just the big ones to name here. But majority of the product-based companies will require a backend. If it is a company or a firm which creates in an application, backend is necessary. And that is exactly why there is a high demand for backend developers out there. All right. So for more information on the entire full stack development course, you could go in and visit www.prepbytes.com for more information on these courses. But apart from that, if you have any queries whatsoever related to backend, feel free to drop it down in the comments below. We will be going and addressing them. And till the next time, take care. Please do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.